I now have the great pleasure of introducing to you someone we have the good fortune of having as a moderator. He, for 30 years, was a correspondent for NBC and CBS. He became the founding director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. He's just finished co-editing a book with Steve Hess about the media and the war on terrorism. He's now working on a book about the impact of the Vietnam War on presidential politics, which is certainly a timely topic. Please join me in welcoming Marvin Kalb.
Marty, thank you very much. You've got me in a high chair here, so I'll probably be standing for much of this time, but I love this kind of a study and these studies. And when I was director at the Shorenstein Center, I tried very hard to stimulate a team of young scholars to delve into specific issues and try to do the kind of content analysis that you did. And I take my hat off to you both if I had one to take off. When one views a lot of these media studies, however, there are problems that come up. And if you read as many of these studies as I have over the years, it is logical for you to conclude that the media is the culprit behind every single problem that we have. And that if there were no media, we would have health care, we would have peace in the Middle East, we would have immigration taken care of just like that. But we do have a media, and it does play a responsible role most of the time. What these studies have done, and I think it's so terribly important, is to give you the insight of how the media works and has worked on one particular issue. But you can take that kind of study and truly apply it to any of the other major issues that are before the country right now. And so from my point of view, it's mostly an up with that cautionary note that we have to be careful about what it is that we're in effect saying about the media. Let me, that having been said, just quickly run off and very briefly, because you have more detailed descriptions of our panelists. A most impressive panel. I was saying before that the best kind of panel these days, you know, when you have a rambunctious media, is to have two people, one representing the far right, the other representing the far left, and the media, the moderator in the middle, being, you know, sent there from God to look after this madness. But here we have 12 panelists, and T. Alexander Alenikoff has been the dean of the Georgetown University Law Center and executive vice president of the Georgetown University since July 2004. Welcome. James Carafano is the assistant director of the Heritage Foundation's Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies and your senior research fellow for defense and homeland security issues. Tamar Jacoby is president and CEO of Immigration Works USA, a national federation of local coalitions working to advance immigration reform. Angela Kelly, where is she? Yes, there she is director of the Immigration Policy Center, IPC, at the American Immigration Law Foundation. Mark Krikorian, to the right, executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization here. And Steve Livingston is professor of media and public affairs and international affairs at the George Washington University. What I would like to do to get us started is to ask you all to give me in 1 minute, less if you can, an answer to a rather simple question, since we're focusing on the impact of the media on immigration legislation. Please provide me with a single illustration. Focus on a single vote if you have to, on a single senator or congressman issue a vote in a committee, how did the media literally affect that vote or that senator? In other words, be as specific as you possibly can. Start with Mark.
Everybody else gets to think about the answer. This is why I wanted
that
the
always
question.
Happens that
this
way.
is why I wanted the question beforehand. But that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to say, honestly. But the one thing that I guess comes to mind is the senators, the Republican senators who were on the fence, the two Georgia senators and several others, were inclined to go along with what their business constituents wanted them to do, which is vote for the package. And I think those, the two Georgia senators got flipped by bloggers, by the talk show host, and the outrage they had stirred up among their.
Do you know that for a fact, or is that your supposition?
That's my supposition. I mean, they haven't told me that, but that's my sense. I mean, I'm not sure anybody would disagree, but I'd love to hear that.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Marvin. When you look at EJ's data, one of the things that stands out to me, and EJ, I'm sure will be happy to correct me if my impression is wrong, but there was a shift in how conservative Americans came to understand immigration right after 2001. And I think what happened there is that in some conservatives, immigration became, it's a cumbersome word, but it became securitized. It was reframed away from an issue of what do we do about the immigrants to what do we do about the potential terrorists that are knocking at our door and coming in and all of that. So as cliche as it may be today, I would say that the one event that perhaps changed the framing of debate was 9/11 and how it came to be re-understood immigration within the context of the larger narrative about terrorism after 9/11.
Alex?
I don't have an answer as to a particular vote that was affected by the media because I'm at least skeptical of the causation claim here, and this is something the social scientists always know, that correlations are not causation. So EJ mentioned the chicken and egg question. It's not clear whether people who are of a certain mind tune into talk radio and find their views reinforced, or whether an unsuspecting person just happens to turn the dial to Rush Limbaugh, and my God, their view is changed because they happen to land there. We can all ask ourselves in our own mind when we go to our computers and go to blogs, do you go to the Drudge Report or do you go to Huffington Post? And that's, maybe you go to both, but there's a selection process here that makes me skeptical of the social science claim. Let me say one other thing if I can. Do I have another 30 seconds more?
Go ahead.
At a time? I think a plausible explanation for the defeat of the legislation is not so much the media's role here, but the fact that you can't beat something with nothing. And there was a coherent story on the right here, whether caused by the media or not, of amnesty being a bad thing. The problem for the legislation, from my mind, is that there was no countervailing narrative on the left. There was no narrative in favor of the legislation except that it was a patchwork of measures that had been put together as a grand bargain. And that's not a legislative strategy. The 1986 legislation actually had a powerful narrative that got it through, which we can talk about later. But there was no compelling narrative here except we've got all the people on the boat together and we've got enough votes maybe to get it through.
Doris?
I can think. I'm not sure. Fish, okay.
Yeah.
I actually do know of a situation in which a vote was directly connected to what members were hearing based on, I think, the media. But I'm not sure that really is as essential. I mean, I happen to have been in a meeting with a senator who was a centrist Democrat who every expectation would be that he would have voted for it, but he just told the group that there was just too much noise. There was just too much in the email, too much talk radio, too much punishment coming at him, and he just couldn't do it. But I think much more broadly that what Alex says is what I would agree with, that this was a situation where there was a very simple one-line negative, no amnesty, and there was no countervailing message on the other side because the other side was much more ambivalent. Now, is that the media's fault? That's obviously what the media covers. It does go to the point that Roberto says about the difficulty of covering complexity as compared to covering, a straightforward one sentence. I think that really is the dilemma.
Which would be true no matter what the subject would be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And you can even go further than that, just to say that the major issues, I think we could all agree, that face us as a country at this point fall into the category of complicated issues that are nuanced, that have lots of different parts, and how do we get public understanding of them?
And really do not play to the media's strength. There are parts of the media which can do very well with complexity, but most of it does not deal with complexity. Most of it these days, unfortunately, and that's been explained, is done through headline services of one sort or another. Angela, you were nodding.
Yeah, I have just two observations building off of what Doris mentioned. I think that this issue, because it's so complex, what we're seeing is the reporting on it very much suffers because there's a shrinking pool of reporters with expertise. If those reporters are covering the story, they get it right. They are very smart about following the details and the nuance and reporting it fairly. If you've got a new reporter or a reporter who's covering many more beats now because there have been layoffs in the industry, then they don't get it right. And they just go for the first press release that they get, which often the restrictionist forces are good at moving lots of press releases into their offices. The second observation is that it's sort of like in the election, there's like this arugula versus Budweiser dynamic, where you've got editorial boards and sort of the elite media that gets the issue and that tends to be more pro-immigrant, quite frankly, but then you've got like the talk radio and talk TV that isn't that way and that is more about, quite frankly, perpetuating myths. And so I think you've got a lot of policymakers that are looking at a Wall Street Journal editorial or New York Times editorial and they want to pay attention to that. But, because of the talk radio, because of the cable TV, they're just getting all these calls. And that's, quite frankly, they're voting with their, what they perceive to be their constituents.
What they perceive to be their constituents. Tamar?
Corinne and I don't agree on much, but the same two senators actually leaped to my mind, Senators Isaacson and Chambliss peeling off from the coalition. But at the same time, I recalled two other very conservative senators who were not peeled off, Senator Lott and Senator Kyle. Mm-hmm. And to me, this points to my general hesitation to attribute too much of this to the media. I mean, I'm not so sure American voters and viewers are as gullible and hypnotizable as we may be suggesting. And that's both bad and good news if you want reform, because I think contrary to some of the assumption in the report, I think Americans are generally concerned about immigration, and I think we should do them justice of addressing their concerns and thinking about them. On the other hand, I think there's a limited influence of media, and the two numbers that really struck me the most in the report were that 53 and 54% of Lou Dobbs viewers and conservatives who listen to talk radio are still for amnesty. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So, who does Lou Dobbs represent? Lou Dobbs talks. Some people listen, but does he really represent a significant number of people? I'm not so sure, and this report really, undercuts the sense that he does represent a lot of people.
Advertiser.
James, are you a watcher? Excuse me.
First of all, for the record, I'd like to say that I like both Arugula and Budweiser. I also just wanted to get from the record that I agree with Tamar and Alex. I mean, there's a lot of the data in the report that I really like, but I think I actually totally disagree with the premise that the media played a negative role in the debate. I think the media just reflected society, and actually I think I might craft an argument that the media actually played a positive role in the debate. But since you're in charge, and I'm an ex-military guy, I follow orders, so I'll give you one example. And it's the example of there was a commercial at the height of the debate. There was a commercial that ran on talk radio that basically it was, well, for the if you add up all the benefits we're going to give these 13 million people by legalizing them, we could buy every illegal immigrant a Mustang. And that commercial generated an enormous amount of emails and phone calls into offices, and it did make a real problem for a segment in the Congress, particularly on the conservative side, who actually may have liked many components of the immigration reform bill, but also kind of saw themselves as fiscal conservatives, and then when they were faced with the criticism of, if you're a fiscal conservative, how can you be signing up for this? They didn't have a real good answer for that, and that data was kind of sprung on them in the 11th hour debate, and I think it created a real problem for them.
EJ, a brief intro.
Yeah, in a way, my answer to your question is Barack Obama, as representative of a lot of liberals, that they were on a key vote. He wanted to put sort of restrictions on the guest worker program because he, like many liberals, preferred to have people move towards citizenship and full rights if you were going to do that. And I think that showed the problem with this bill, which does get to the media, that opponents of the bill really hated it and supporters barely liked it. And that's not a good balance, because a lot of the liberals who were naturally in favor of immigration were very uneasy because they worried about worker rights with some of the guest worker provisions. And I think that refracted back in the media, that Banu's study showing that the conservative media were mobilized, the liberal media weren't mobilized because there was ambivalence about the product itself. And so I think there's a feed back and forth between media and the
is in and of itself many dimensional. People hear the word or they're asked the question, are you concerned with immigration? Do you think we need to do something with immigration? They have an idea of what that means. It could be economic, it could be cultural, it could be something on their block, it could be something national, and it's not clear what people are saying when they say they are concerned with immigration. So there's a vagueness there. And I think the media has played a role in providing something on the other side of the word, what immigration equals, whether it means illegality, whether it means diversity, whether it means anything in between those two things is up to the individual and the public at large.
Peter, please.
Yes, thank you. I guess I wanted to weigh in a bit on the side of skepticism about to some extent, about the influence of the media in this debate. At least while I thought these papers were really good and very careful in terms of making limited claims about the influence of the media, I do worry that there might be a tendency here, or once they're beyond here in response to these, that of a tendency to kind of criticize, if not exactly kill the messenger, because you don't like the message. And there's several sort of underlying social political realities that I think it's worth invoking at this point. There is a substantial class bias in terms of who benefits and who doesn't benefit from immigration today. One of the most consistent findings of economists is that while immigration doesn't tend to change the total GDP very much, if at all, it does have an enormous distributional effect. There are clear, or at least there are winners and losers. Maybe it's not clear winners and losers, but there are winners and losers here. And at the same time, there's definitely been a tendency for elites in American society, as in other Western societies, to not to try to keep immigration off the agenda. Over the longer view of this, over the last 25 years, it's been a while coming before we get here in Washington really focusing on this issue. And it seems to me that all adds up to a scenario whereby, like it or not, there was a substantial vacuum in the public sphere whereby entrepreneurs like a Lou Dobbs filled it. And I think that's an important aspect of this that needs to be acknowledged. And I'd also just point out, too, in terms of a skepticism about the influence of the media here, that when Roberto, in his fine paper, which I really enjoyed, talks about employers being left out of the narrative. Well, clearly they have been, but let's face it, the political actors also had good reasons to leave the employers out of the narrative. They're the more powerful elements in this story. The immigrants are the weakest elements. Not well situated to fight back at all, but employers clearly are. It's no accident that they're left out of the narrative. It's not the media's doing, it's the political system's doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Mark, hang on just one sec. I want Roberto to come in, and then we'll go to you.
Just very briefly on the question of causality, as Peter said, the claims of causality are quite limited, and very much recognize there were a great many factors that determine the course of immigration policy. But I think it's important to note, particularly in terms of partisan media, both on cable talk and radio, it's not a matter of persuading people to change their views. It's a matter of mobilizing people of a certain point of view to say this issue is important, to give them talking points and to provoke reaction. That's what we saw very effectively and very powerfully, particularly in 2007, when conservative talk radio mobilized in a very specific period of time, working in loose conjunction with a variety of advocacy groups to define the bill in certain terms as amnesty and to mobilize people of like views to take action. So it's not a matter of persuasion, but of mobilization. Meanwhile, the rest of the media has conditioned a lot of the public to be skeptical of government whenever it tries to undertake something large and complex, particularly on this subject. It's an uphill struggle in dealing with public opinion to convince them to embrace a large government enterprise that touches on many aspects of life and the economy. The Senate strategy, as created by Ted Kennedy and enunciated very specifically, was to move the bill so quickly in a week. Haven't heard that very recently. We've got to do it in a week. Before you had an opportunity for forces to define and mobilize on it. And it was defeated in particular because of delays in the process of legislating and opportunities to mobilize opposition that those delays provided.
And it's interesting, too, you raised the issue of advocacy and journalism, and Lou Dobbs calls himself an advocacy journalist. And it really cuts to the heart of what journalism is supposed to be doing in this country, whether it's supposed to be in there to advocate a particular line or to just lay out the evidence as best it could. And I think we are at a point where enough advocacy now appears to blot out that central function of good journalism. Mark and Angela. Yeah.
Thank you, Marvin. I had a couple of points. I wanted to agree partly with Peter and partly with Roberto. When Roberto says that the new media exacerbated some of the tendencies of the way the old media covered the issue, the focus on illegality, the ebb and flow of coverage, I think that's correct. And if I could add parenthetically, I'm waiting for another surge in coverage because I have a book I'm trying to sell, and it's not going anywhere when the newspapers aren't talking about it. But the new case against immigration from Sentinel on Amazon now. My publisher will thank me. But I would challenge most of the people's dissent here that the new media in particular, did not have that much of an effect. I think it did have an effect, although I think it's different. I mean, I guess I'm agreeing with what Roberto said to some degree. The fact is, what the new media did is take the issue, the debate over the issue, out of the hands of the elites, which is exclusively where it was. It wasn't just that it allowed mobilization by the opponents. It actually permitted opponents to hear the views that they weren't hearing, and hear essentially their own views. It was a kind of a populist uprising that new media made possible, because this is one of those elite public issues that's much bigger split than on most other issues. And I would also challenge the basic premise that the way this is covered has stymied policymaking, resulted in stalemate. I would actually submit that precisely because of the new media, we didn't have no policy. We had a different policy. Stopping what the advocates succeeded in getting reporters to call comprehensive immigration reform was actually a success. That was a policy, and the resulting policy is an executive branch policy of stepped-up enforcement, more worksite enforcement, expanded use of verification, et cetera, et cetera. That is a policy, and that is what the new media actually made possible. So policymaking worked. It's just that the policy the elite preferred wasn't successful.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to go to 3 raised hands on this side and then go back to Angela over here. Yes, Steve, you're first.
I find myself in an unusual position because I think I want to defend the media, and this is from somebody who just published a book called When the Press Fails, University of Chicago Press. Let's talk about this idea that Lou Dobbs represents a part of this new media landscape, and that he's doing something called advocacy journalism, and that he panders to people's fears and anxieties. But is that new, or are we looking at old wine in new bottles? I'm certainly not a historian, but I do recall reading about Father Coughlin in the 1930s using a new media then, radio, to do similar sorts of things. So I guess one of the places I would like to begin is wonder if, despite the enormous amount of work that must have gone into analyzing 1,300 stories a week, I do that in a year maybe, total of almost 80,000 stories, I wonder if the 1980 bookend is not giving us the historical perspective to see the current debate accurately or at least fully. That would be the first thing. So I guess here my question is this moment in history the product of new media, or is it a manifestation of an old story? If it's a manifestation of an old story, what's ringing in my ears are some of the words that we've been listening to: confusion, ambivalence. Haven't we historically looked to immigration ambivalently? On the one hand, we are an immigrant society. On the other hand, we've had a series of times in our history where we've treated the immigrant as somehow a dangerous new element in our midst. So I'm left wondering, is it a media event? Is it something driven by the media, or is it something deeper, a cultural phenomenon that we're looking at?
Very good point. James, please.
Thanks. My latest book is called Private Sector, Public Wars, Contractors in Combat. There's nothing in it about immigration, but it is available in bookstores near you and Amazon.com. Okay, I thought Marvin actually brought up the quintessential point, not just for this study, but for all the studies in this area, which is fundamentally what is the purpose of the press? What is its role? Because in the end, that's the metric by which you're going to measure success or failure. Again, the Constitution says guarantees freedom of the press. Essentially, you have a free press to guarantee freedom of expression. And in that respect, I think Mark's perhaps right. The media did its job and actually did its job very well and perhaps played a very positive role. But if your argument is that somehow the media has a unique obligation to inform a citizenry or create informed citizenry, then you could maybe argue that it failed. But I'm not so sure that is a mantle that's really the media's job, that we have to rely on the press to have an informed citizenry, and without a press that kind of tells us the right narrative, we're not going to have an informed citizenry. I think that's actually not a very constructive construct. I mean, I've heard several narratives here today, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. So, I think if we think in a strict fundamental first principle method of what the press was created for, I would maybe argue that here the press did exactly what the founders wanted it to do.
Tamar?
Yeah, I'm struck by Roberto's point about what the press did was really not persuade people, it was mobilize a small group of like-minded people, because I think that highlights exactly what did happen last year. This wasn't the majority of Americans standing up and saying no to this bill. It was a small but vocal minority, very loud, very vocal. They sent a lot of emails, they made a lot of phone calls, they sent a lot of bricks, but it was still a small but vocal minority. And for me, that points, interestingly, to maybe what the answer is. I mean, as I was reading these papers, I kept saying, well, okay, this is true, but now what can we have done about it? We're not going to silence Lou Dobbs. But it points to me that the answer is not a kind of anti-Lou Dobbs, is not the Lou Dobbs on the left, so to speak. The answer is objective journalism or the mainstream media or what have you, better journalism, pointing to the reality of these numbers. I mean, Lou Dobbs mobilized a small number of people, and they made a lot of noise, but we didn't read enough on the front page of the New York Times that it was really a small number. And that's kind of that would be how objective journalism would fight back against these guerrillas, so to speak, that we're concerned about.
But if it is a small minority, then where was the majority? Angela, you wanted to add something, and Peter did.
I did. I don't have a book. I feel like a slacker. No, it gets to this causation question, and I have three observations about 06 and 07, and then sort of more broadly in terms of how the media reports and the influence on the public. In 07, the issue was that it was sort of like the Rosemary's Baby of bills. It was really ugly, and even those of us who were working hard to get it to move, kind of did holding our nose. So I think the observation that those on the left weren't, loving the bill and weren't activating the left is completely accurate, in stark contrast to what happened on the right. In 06, though, it's really clear, and it gets back to your first question, that the DJs that turned out folks in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Dallas, in Washington, D.C., had a direct impact in what was happening in the Senate Judiciary Committee. When the Senate Judiciary Committee was marking up what was the McCain-Kennedy bill that Specter tried to tinker with some, quite frankly, it was often only Ted Kennedy in the room during the markups. And it was all the Republicans. They were all there in their suits. And it was Ted Kennedy. As the marches began to happen, Dick Durbin started showing up. Dianne Feinstein was there. Joe Biden came. Feingold came. So there was an increased interest on the Democrats' part as folks began to take to the streets in a very peaceful way, saying that they wanted to be part of this country, they wanted to be recognized, and they weren't felons. And it was, quite frankly, a delayed reaction to the Sensenbrenner bill, which passed very quickly in December of 05. In 06, these marches began to happen at the time that the markup was happening, and I think there was a direct correlation with the DJs who got on the radio waves in Spanish and turned people out. There's no denying it. More broadly, though, because at the Immigration Policy Center, I work really hard to try to debunk a number of myths that are out there. And based on public opinion research, it's really clear to me that the public is convinced that immigrants commit crimes at a much higher rate than native-born. Hundreds of years of research says that that's not the case, but the public believes it. Why does the public believe it? Well, I think it's in this report. It's because that is the story that always gets told. If there is a horrible crime committed, and if it's by an immigrant, their immigration status becomes the lead more than anything else surrounding the crime. So it is, to me, that and the other persistent myth that people choose to be here illegally, I think relates to the point that I made earlier. They have a lot of reporters that don't understand the complexities of immigration law and are reporting on it often inaccurately. So people, the average American, thinks that if you just went to the post office, you could get your green card. So there is a big disconnect between what the public gets and what the reality is.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Yes, I was going to raise a different question, but I want to respond to what Angela just said, because I thought her comments were really quite interesting and on target. She mentions the issue of crime in immigration, and I think that's a good one to stop and look at for a minute, because I agree with her that the evidence is not there that immigrants commit crime disproportionately. In fact, they may even commit it disproportionately in lower terms. However, I think that's a good example of how the issue gets framed in a way that really misses what's on the public's mind, even though the public itself, because immigration is such a complicated and often myth-laden symbolic subject, doesn't express its own anxieties very well. And frankly, I think that's partly because elites often haven't really helped them very much sort of figure out what's eating them. And guys like Lou Dobbs, again, like I said, filled in the vacuum. But with regard to crime per se, I don't think crime is really what's on people's minds. I think it's what I call social order or social disorder that's part of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with such mass numbers of people moving from one country to another, moving around a lot in this country. When you've got neighborhoods of cities that used to be single-family homes, within which, over a period of months or so, suddenly a house that was occupied by a family of 4 or 5 is suddenly occupied by 20 young men, hardworking young men who are working in shifts and sleeping in shifts in that house, and who have 15 cars that they're parked all over the lawns in the street. That begins to get neighborhoods anxious, and it begins to give people the sense that the social fabric is fraying, and that gets caught up in a broader frame of crime. But it's not crime; it's social disorder, and I think that's an example of what's eating at people, and it gets talked about as crime in a very misleading way, unfair to immigrants, but also misunderstanding what the problem is.
Thank you very much, Peter. E.J.
First of all, I was trying to think of who would be the exact opposite of Lou Dobbs, and the one name that came to mind was Calvin Coolidge, but we won't have to think about it. I want to try to do the impossible, which is to reconcile Mark's point with Tamar's point. Peter and Mark, and I like Peter's last point, by the way, but Peter and Mark are absolutely right. There is a real class split on this issue. Lower income Americans outside the Latino community, non-college grads, are more skeptical of immigration than upper income Americans and Americans with high levels of education. So there is a populist thing going on here in part. But populist sometimes suggests a mass majority movement. And I think what you actually have is a very important, sizable minority that is very strongly against immigration. You tend to get a majority will say that they support a comprehensive solution that leads to a path to citizenship, though many parts of that majority are very grudging. So it's a complicated picture. There is some populism here. I think that is what gives the anti-immigrant argument or the restrictionist argument its power, but it's still not representative of a majority of Americans.
Audrey?
Well, I wanted to go back to Peter's point about the connection between the local and the national, and how changes on the ground and perceptions of changes in everyday life for people in communities across the country may have been influenced by what was happening nationally, both with the policy debates and with the media coming into play. So we all know that headlines started screaming out sometime after the 2000 census was released that there were more immigrants here than ever before, and they lived in many new places where they had never lived before. And for the last 5, 6, 7 years, every time the census releases data, which is very often if you follow this thing, and since I'm a demographer, I have to keep up with this all the time, we get a new round of headlines proclaiming the same thing over and over again, either that immigration's on the rise or immigrants are in new places, and then that's also connected with the changing racial and ethnic composition of the country. And so these kinds of stories are not just national, and they tend to be heavily played up in local areas. And this is something that in local communities, and we've seen there's so many examples across the country where it's not necessarily the base population that's at issue, but it's the pace of change. We're going to have bumper stickers. It's not the base, it's the pace made. But, where change is fast and people want an answer and people would like to have control, they're looking to their local elected officials. And those people are coming back to their constituents and saying, we're not really in charge of this. We need to get on the feds for this. So there is this big connection that can't be missed, and it's taken on great importance over the last 4 or 5 years.
I think it's a terribly important point because we all live locally. What we know nationally is through the media. And that places this enormous responsibility on the media today to convey some kind of honesty across the board so there's a common perception of the problem, and yet it is often perceived locally. And locally, I think all of us are aware, for example, of an enormous increase, or so it appears, in the number of Hispanics who are suddenly around you. You don't know. I mean, when I left to go up to Cambridge, where we lived for 12 years, and then when I came back to Chevy Chase, it seemed as if the entire community, except for the people who lived in the houses, had changed. People who picked up the garbage, people who cut the grass, all of that was suddenly Hispanic. Black had gone somewhere else. And so the problem is local, big time, but when we try to understand it, what can we do? How many of us here actually watch Lou Dobbs? 1, 2, 3. Oh, all kinds of people watch Lou Dobbs. Well, that's good.
A lot of immigration junkies.
Okay, now, Alex and James, you wanted to come in.
Just 2 observations. I don't think one should focus on the complexity of the issue as an explanation for why there can't be a coherent narrative. Let me say this. So it's been posed that we had an easy story on one side, no amnesty, against a very complicated story about the benefits of immigration. That's not the media's problem in telling the story. That's a failure on the proponents of the legislation to tell a coherent story. I mean, that's what politics is supposed to be, a way to take complex ideas and not dumb them down, but talk about them in a way that people can relate to them. And that may have been because there was sort of lukewarm support for the legislation, but nonetheless, that's a failure of proponents of immigration. I don't think proponents have gotten the story down in a very in a sellable way. Secondly, both Marvin's comment and Audrey's comment before that, I think, points to something that is lacking in the report and is fundamental to the debate, and that is the issue of race. If we had been talking about legalizing the 30,000 undocumented Irish in Boston, this would not have been an issue. And there is an issue of culture, there's an issue of fear of loss of country here that is largely race-based, and I think we have to confront that. In the same way the Hillary Clinton voters in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the press was willing to say that this was in some ways a race-based vote that was creating victories among lower-class workers, and historically the populist movement has been linked to, has been race-baited, quite frankly. The history of populism is often related to white supremacy or anti-black attitudes in the South. And I think that we've gone sort of the whole hour and a half here on immigration debate without talking seriously about race, I think is really the big elephant in the room that we're not talking about.
Point. EJ has a brief insert.
A piece of data, 2006 Gallup poll, 20% of Americans said too many immigrants were coming from Europe. 31% said too many immigrants were coming from Asia. 39% said too many immigrants were coming from Arab countries. And 48% said too many immigrants were coming from Latin American countries. So there clearly is, whether you call it race or whether you call it, people feel there are a lot of Hispanics here, there is clearly a difference in attitude. So you're broadly right, the Irish, according to public opinion, might fare better than Latinos.
Right.
One comment and 3 quick points. I think fundamentally about immigration, this is not a 50-50 country on this issue, and this is not a black and white issue of liberals versus conservatives, and you've got to get past that to really understand the data. And all the things that we've talked about, I think, in my experience, is regional, class, economics, language, ethnicity, all those factors really fill in. You can look at 2 people who seem to you both Asian Americans sitting, and I can turn to one, and they're radically against it, the other one's radically for it. So yeah, I think you have to look at all these factors, and I think that explains very simply why the bill failed. There was simply something in it that everybody could hate. whether you were really for immigration or really against it. You could find something in the bill you just found abhorrent. And that's exactly why neither candidate is talking about this issue, because they both know they don't own their parties on one issue, and whatever they say, they're going to alienate as many supporters as they can. That's why they've both kind of taken it off the table. So I just want to finish with my one quick story, because I actually have an Obama story. And I forget the exact language in Obama's amendment, but it was kind of like 1/10 enforcement and kind of 9/10 liberalization. So I actually wrote a short piece on this at the Heritage Foundation saying, there's a lot I like in the Obama amendment, but there's some stuff in here I really don't like. And it's my one and only phone call from anybody in Obama's office that I've ever gotten. And this guy called and he's vociferously arguing with me that I'm just wrong. Well, what I was arguing is that the enforcement part in the Obama piece was bad, and the liberalization parts were fine. And he was yelling at me. And I thought, this is a very perverse world in which we live. When I'm arguing, when the guy at the Heritage Foundation is arguing your measure is not liberal enough, and the Obama guy is saying, you're not tough enough on immigration enforcement.
Thank you, Jay. Doris.
Let me try to take another shot at this issue of local experience and the issue that Alex raises about race. And that is that there's no question but that the sense that your world and where you live is changing under your nose, because it is changing under your nose. I mean, we're going through an enormous, profound demographic change in this country, and in some ways the story is that it's happening as effectively, in fact, as it is happening. I mean, certainly there is tension and strife, but there isn't the kind of tension and strife that we've seen in prior periods in our history when similar things were happening. But setting that aside, there is another phenomenon here that is at play, and that is that the immigrant that you know, legal or illegal, in your community who does your lawn or who takes care of your children or who is part of the painting crew that did a good job on your house, you like that person, by and large, regardless of his race or her race or ethnicity. But abstracted, those illegal immigrants or those big demographic changes are really hurting the country. And how you reconcile those, and there's really no reconciling of those going on. I mean, I remember this kind of thing vividly from being in the government. I could be testifying on the Hill and be railed and railed against about illegal immigration and what the problem is and why weren't we doing about it, et cetera, and get back to my office and literally have a message on my desk from the congressman that was railing against me, asking for some compassionate consideration of a particular foreign student who had overstayed their visa because they really were contributing to the community. And it was wrong to send that person home. Now, this is very much like people hate Congress. The approval ratings of Congress are 19% now or some such thing. It's unbelievable. But by and large, you poll people, they like their local representative. They think their local representative does pretty well for them. And so that connecting of the dots or that lack of connecting of the dots, obviously, is something that I think is a press issue. There are ways to make some of those crosswalks, and they are not happening.
And, of course, if the paint job was bad, then that painter is really illegal.
Probably.
Out he goes. Mark.
Thank you, Marvin. I had a point I wanted to respond to a couple points. First, though, the reason the candidates aren't talking about this is because they agree. Their positions are identical, and so what's the debate? Secondly, I'd have to say, and no disrespect toward Doris at all, but all of the talk that we hear about immigrants, doing our lawns, immigrants taking care of our children, most people do their own lawns. Most people take care of their own kids and cook their own dinner. It's a clear indication of the class division on this issue. But the point I wanted to make specifically was on this race issue, and I think there's something there to debunk it to some degree. EJ talked about, people wouldn't be all that much opposed to the 30,000 Irish being legalized. Well, there's a difference between 30,000 people and 12 million people. If it was 12 million Irishmen being legalized, I don't know, you might have some people concerned about that. And the statistics about the people, the number of people objecting to, thinking there was too much European immigration and too much Asian immigration. Well, the Europeans make up the smallest share of the immigration flow, so, it's at least arguable that even if there were some objective way to measure it, they would be the least likely for people to perceive that as being excessive, and likewise for Latinos. But the media angle here, I think, is important related to the race. There is, as Audrey says, every time there's a report from the Census Bureau, a lot of them are, whites will be a minority in 2040 or 2050 or whatever it is. There is a triumphalism about that in all media coverage of those reports that I think grates on people, even those people who don't have problems with organically changing racial composition. They don't have problems with individual people of different ethnic groups, but the triumphalism of that reporting that, thank God, finally whites will be a minority in the United States by 2050, grates on a lot of people. It really does. And that's a side of it that I think the members of the journalist class don't get, because for the most part, even if they don't perceive it, they also see that as a positive thing. They are looking forward to that development, and they write the stories that way.
Be specific. Who is being triumphant here?
The news coverage.
Which reporter? Which network? Be more specific.
I can't, because but
that's a serious charge.
Well, let me put it this way. I perceive it as triumphant, and I can guarantee you that ordinary folks actually reading the Post and the New York Times and the AP coverage on this, increasing ethnic diversity of the United States perceive a certain triumphalism in saying that this is a good thing. Now, is it good? Is it bad? Let's debate that. But I'm saying that that's one of the things that sort of grates on people and results in this kind of populist anger.
Roberto?
Yeah, just very quickly, Mark, I don't think you can demonstrate that point empirically. And in fact, a lot of the coverage is sort of, oh my God, we're losing. And one other point, the New York Times, the last headline in August on the numbers was pretty much written that way. And the other point that's worth making is that, in this I can demonstrate empirically, that in most of the coverage, of the repeated coverage over and over again of the changing demographics of the country, there's one voice of advocacy that is quoted more often than any others, and it's you and Camarada talking about how bad it is. And there's nobody on the other side quoted in these stories saying this is a great thing. But the Center for
when have we ever talked about that? We don't usually do those.
I can show you the stories in which you are, because reporters turn to you as the reasonable voice.
And we are
of saying these things, and you're a good dial quote on it. So you end up actually, if there is a counterpoint, and you're complaining about something in which you've actually had extraordinary success. Can I go on to one other point?
Absolutely, you've got the mic.
Thank you. I do have the mic.
I earned this one.
I earned it. Yeah. On this question of the way people react to immigration, there was when I was still at Pew, we worked on did a big survey of the general population and attitudes towards immigration. One of the most interesting findings was that negative views of immigration correlated with low density of foreign-born in a respondent's zip code or county. In other words, the people who lived in places with the least number of immigrants had the most negative views. There's an element of self-selection in this, and you can just look at who lives on both coasts, and where in this country the foreign-born are still highly concentrated in a few places, and the non-immigrants who still live in those places have, for the most part, made choices. If you're white and you don't like to live in a highly immigrant society, you're living in Southern California by now, you're in Utah or Oregon or Seattle or someplace else. So the media role in this is really quite important, because often people are forming opinions about something they have not really experienced, certainly not experienced in a large scale. And even whether they're generalizing from a gardener or not even having seen a gardener, this is a phenomenon where people are drawing conclusions based very substantially not on robust actual personal knowledge of the phenomena, but on what they are told about it from various realms, which makes it, I found it a very compelling case study, and it is one of the ways that that opinion towards immigration, I think, has developed. It is very easy to see immigrants as the human face of other changes. And Americans are reacting to a great many changes. Somebody mentioned the loss of sense of security after 2001. Now we're looking at an economy where nobody really understands how our financial markets work. People were reacting to a change in the sense of place and the importance of geography and how you define an individual locality in a global world. And immigrants are the human manifestation of all these things and end up being the freight on which a great deal of these attitudes fall.
Thank you very much. Tamar.
Roberto's pointing out an old human truth, familiarity breeds acceptance. But I wanted to go back to this issue of race and how much of a role race plays in Americans' anxieties about immigration. And undoubtedly it does. I mean, surely it does, and surely it does for many people. But I also think that is a little bit too easy, and that I think those of us who want more sensible policy, again, it doesn't really serve us to demonize and write off people's concerns as merely racism. I mean, it's a part of it. We can argue about how much, but I think those of us who are trying to fight for something different ought to be careful in casting it in quite so easy a way. That said, I think it's true that the debate is really one of emotion versus pragmatism. It's about fear, and fear perhaps of the other, fear of what's out of control, fear of change, versus some sort of pragmatism about what do we do with the situation we find ourselves in and with the big demographic and geographical and economic forces that Roberto's talking about. And I think that's just an important big frame to put it in. It is about emotion versus some sort of pragmatism. And I think Alex, you're right that those of us who want reform could do a lot better job of framing a narrative, but I think it's a lot harder because we're framing a narrative for pragmatism up against emotion, and that's just hard. And so I think it's, you're right in your challenge, but it's a difficult challenge, and I think it's a challenge for those of us who care about reform, but it's also a challenge for the media. I keep coming back to what do we do about Lou Dobbs? How does a more objective media counter his emotion and the emotions he stirs? And I think it's difficult. And I mean, surely it is with a better narrative, but it's hard.
There is also, I suspect, and I'm sure it's commonly recognized, a deep, powerful, underlying belief that this society is based on law, that you want things that are legal. And if you can point to something numbering in 13 million or something that is regarded or described as illegal, you sort of pull back almost instinctively. Angela, very patient. I thank you for that.
Thank you. I want to take it back to race for a second and, what we've seen, quite frankly, unfold over the last 15 months since the bill failed. And, I thought it was a debate about changing immigration policy, but what resulted was really a debate about how America is changing and what its character is going to be. And probably the thing that has upset me the most isn't what happened on June 28th or even in the months since then, but it was a report that Pew Hispanic Center recently released. It hasn't gotten a lot of coverage, at least not in English language media, about Latinos and the discrimination that they're experiencing. And the statistic that jumped out the most is that 1 in 10, both native-born and foreign-born Latinos, has been stopped and asked for papers. 1 in 10 has been asked for papers. That is having a profound effect in our communities. I have this great Irish last name, but I'm not Irish. My family's from South America. Most of my family speaks with accents. I've had family members that have been undocumented. They're legal now. But they're experiencing discrimination and racism and a sense that there's a change in the country, that they're not welcomed anymore, in a way that makes me really sad for my kids. And to me, that's the core issue here. We can talk about the numbers, we can talk about the fee for people who've broken the law and try to get them on the right side of the law, but ultimately it's about the character of our country. And until really, quite frankly, leaders step up and identify this as an issue that they want to change. It's not about immigration policy, but it's about who we want to be. I think that's what's lacking. I think it's somebody who's willing to identify this issue and make it their own. And we'll be debating this until that happens, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. Peter?
Yes, I wanted to pick up on this, the race issue as well. But, you know, I at the risk of sounding either provocative or naive, I don't quite know always what is meant when people raise the question of race in these kinds of discussions. I think back, for example, to the Rodney King trial, if we can think back that far. You may recall, maybe not quite well as I do, because I was focused on it at the time, that Rodney King was mercilessly beat up by 5 white cops. Well, one of those white cops was a guy named Alex Briseño, who was actually Mexican-American. But that never saw the light of day because I think the Los Angeles Times didn't want it to see the light of day because they thought that Los Angeles had enough problems at that point in its history, not introducing that particular source of tension. But then when the scene shifted to the Simi Valley for the trial of those cops, we were told repeatedly by the Los Angeles Times that those white cops were being tried by a racially mixed jury that consisted of something like 6 whites, 3 blacks, and 3 Latinos. So in one context, Latinos were Latinos, but in another context, a Latino was white. You know, half of Latinos in this country identify themselves as white. That doesn't mean they don't get discriminated against or singled out. But it does mean that this is a pretty complicated topic when it comes to Latino immigrants. And so and when you look at intermarriage rates for the 3rd generation of Latinos, they're more likely to marry outside their group, more likely to marry a non-Latino white than they are a Latino. So it becomes really difficult to know exactly what's being claimed when Alex raises the issue of racism. Now, it seems to me there's lots of other dynamics going on in terms of perceived economic competition, dislocations of the sorts that I was talking about that are much more concrete and real and not simply emotional phantasms, which I think is what I'm hearing to some extent from some of my fellow panelists. And that may be in play. Those may be in play. But they're awfully hard to get a handle on here, it seems to me. And it seems to me there are much more parsimonious and concrete ways to explain the negative reactions, not all of which are rational. I'm not suggesting that at all. But there are more concrete ways to try to understand what's going on than I think race, broadly construed.
Okay, now race has come up. EJ's got his hand up. Alex, you raised it, so I'm wondering if you want to have a comment and, in a sense, to answer.
Well, I didn't use the word racism. Peter did. I think I find myself in agreement with Tamar. I think she said it exactly right. So I'm happy to stand by her comments.
Okay, James?
To follow up, and certainly there is demonization, but I think it's also fair to say there's demonization on both sides. I mean, the one side, it's people that actively played into fears about immigration, which are historic and cultural, that you can go back for centuries. But on the other side, they were playing on fear as well, and they were playing on fear of the critics on the right, that these were evil, know-nothing people. And so, for example, you hear a critic on the right, they say, well, they're against immigration. Now, that critic may be against illegal immigration. They may be perfectly happy with legal immigration, but they don't make that distinction when they say they're against immigration as if they're against anybody that came to this country regardless of whether legal or illegal. And so I think that is a large part of the problem. And I point out that we're really going in a healthy direction here because what is the response of the far left been to talk radio on the right? Well, we went out and created Air America so we could have equally kind of silly sounding people on the left. So that's very helpful and productive.
It just isn't doing terribly well, is it? EJ.
Just on this question, the Irish versus the rest, first we should recall that in the 19th century, the signs didn't say no Latinos need apply. They said no Irish need apply. So that part of the immigration issue always in our country is who is the other at any particular moment. Once upon a time it was the Irish. Now it's predominantly Latino. I want to agree in part and yeah, you've got to get that on the record. But I agree with Mark and disagree in part with Mark that, of course, you're right that people identify Latino immigration more in a more negative way because there are more immigrants on the whole coming in from Central America and South America. So you're right. It's not all by any means race and culture. On the other hand, your own response suggested that clearly, whether you want to call it race or whether you want to call it culture, that is part of the response to the Latino immigration. It is part of the sense of disorder that Peter talked about, the sense of somebody losing control that we talked about. And this, again, is an old story in American history. The Irish felt that way about my French Canadians when we came into New England. But there clearly is an element here of something connected to race and culture, even though there is also a sense of injustice against illegal immigration. There are complicated reactions here, but I don't think you can deny, your very answer suggests you understand that there is this cultural or racial component.
And I don't want to defend the bigot, so to speak, but there is a difference between race and culture. I mean, it's one thing to say American politics are going to look like Mexican politics, and, the rule of law is we're going to go to bribing, our relationship with the cops are going to look like what happens in Mexico, and being a bigot. I mean, race and culture are different, or political values are different. And I'm not saying we should be afraid of Latinos for that reason, and I'm not saying that, again, racism is okay, and I think those people who fear that the culture is going to go in those directions are wrong, but I think it's important to draw a distinction between race and culture.
All good things come to an end, and we're about 5 minutes away from the end of this panel discussion. So I want to simply say, if you have something that you would like to end with, please raise your hand now. I can't read your minds. Mark.
I wanted to end with, ironically enough, agreeing with Tamar that there's a difference between race and culture, but I want to get to this point, and this is important, I think, in the way the media and the public look at these group of issues. And this is what EJ was talking about as the other. The Irish were the other. Well, the fact is the circle of who is on the inside and who is on the outside, who's us and who's them, has been steadily expanding in American history for centuries. I mean, if you were an English Protestant in Massachusetts Bay Colony of the wrong kind, they hanged you if you were a Quaker and didn't leave. English Protestants then were okay, and German Protestants were bad. Ben Franklin complained about German Protestants. There were just too many of them. Then Northern European Protestants were okay. Northern European Catholics showed up. They eventually became okay. Eastern and Southern Europeans came. They eventually became okay. And today, what we're seeing is Hispanics and Asians are in effect becoming white, socially speaking. They're white. And the divide in American society that constantly gets harped on is white versus non-white. And in fact, I think it's much more relevant, much more salient, is the divide between black versus non-black. And today's immigrants are on the same side of that line as those in the past. And I think the way we talk about Latinos as a separate race, and I would submit even East and South Asians as somehow separate, is misconstruing the way race actually is lived in the United States.
Okay. Peter, briefly, please.
Yes, I just wanted to make one final point about race. I guess, again, responding to Angela's point. Obviously, I'm responding to the Kelly in her name. And try to make it concrete. It's not often pointed out in forums such as this, it seems to me, that 80% of illegal immigrants are Latinos. That's why so many Latinos get stopped. Is it fair that they get stopped? No. But that's a problem that speaks to the huge numbers of Latinos we're dealing with. Historically, we haven't seen such huge concentrations from one sociolinguistic cultural group, with the possible exception of the Germans in the 19th century. And it's an unfortunate logic that you can see possibly taking hold in the public, that if 80% of illegals are Latinos, then if you're Latino, you must be illegal, which doesn't follow logically, but follows sociologically.
But it doesn't. Because
Into the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, the real question is what proportion of Latinos are illegal? I mean,
I understand.
People should be smart enough to draw that distinction.
But they may not be, and that's a public policy.
Should be smart enough. Can I make one last point? I'm just struck by, as we end, we've committed exactly the sin that Roberto accused the media of committing, and that we agree it really is the point at the heart of this report, is that we've ended up focusing on those individual actors and not on the larger geographic and demographic and economic forces that drive this. And it's all but inevitable, but we are guilty, and it's why this is such a hard debate.
Let me just try very quickly to wrap this up. I've done probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of panels. This has been a good one. And it's a good one because it's a terrific subject, an important subject, very articulate panelists and very knowledgeable. So my thanks go out to them, and I think collectively we could thank them. And this overall, the headline for all of this is Democracy in the Age of New Media. And I can't confess to you, as someone who for the last 20 years has been trying to understand what I was part of for the preceding 30 years, I suffer on alternate days when I observe what the media has become. But I suffer only on alternate days, because I'm also aware on the other days that without the media, even in its occasionally enfeebled state, it is the only way we know anything, and it's the only way democracy in the age of the new media can survive. The only way. Thank you all very much. Pleasure.